Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're going all the way back to 1937
Oh,
with
wow.
Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Classic.
Yeah, it's one of those books that,
Mm.
you hear about it your whole life, but maybe you haven't actually read it.
Have you read it?
I have read it,
Okay.
and
Perfect.
it's really good.
It's so good.
I mean, it's still a bestseller for a reason.
It's incredible.
And to think, it all started because
Yeah.
Dale Carnegie was teaching these courses, and he did this big survey.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, what are people most interested in?
Right.
And turns out
Mm-hmm.
people are more interested in
Yeah.
getting along with each
It's
other
human relations.
than almost anything else.
It's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Because you would think finances or,
Yeah, you would think like how to make money
Yeah,
or,
exactly.
something like that.
Yeah, practical skills.
Yeah.
Hard skills,
But no, it's like, how do I talk to my neighbor?
That's right.
How do I
How to get along with your spouse. How to raise your kids.
get my coworkers to cooperate?
Right.
So where do we even begin with this book? Because there's just so much in here.
Well, I think there's one principle that's like the bedrock.
Okay.
And it's so simple, it's so obvious, but so hard to do.
Lay it on me.
Don't criticize, condemn, or complain.
Okay.
Like he compares it to, if you want honey, don't go kicking over a beehive.
Oh, yeah.
You're not going to get the honey if you make the bees mad.
You're just going to get stung.
Right, exactly.
And I think that's such a good analogy for
Yeah.
when you come at somebody with negativity, nobody wants to
Nobody wants to be criticized.
be criticized. Nobody wants to feel condemned, and nobody wants to hear you complain
And the thing is, people justify their actions,
all the time.
Yeah, even the worst criminals, like Al Capone,
Al Capone.
like this notorious gangster, he truly believed that he was doing a service.
Oh, wow.
He couldn't see his own actions as the problem.
That's
And it's not just criminals, even like really high up.
yeah.
Like think about the Teapot Dome scandal.
Oh,
Never
yeah.
follow this guy, who was like the Secretary of the Interior.
Wow.
He was taking bribes to lease out oil reserves.
So he's super high up in the government.
Very powerful man.
Uh-huh.
And even with all the evidence
Wow.
against him, he just couldn't admit that he had done anything wrong.
So how do we break out of this cycle of criticism and defensiveness?
Well, and I think a really good example is Lincoln.
Oh, okay.
Early on in his career, Lincoln was known for being super critical and sarcastic and even writing these anonymous letters
Oh, wow.
that ended up really hurting him more than helping him.
That's interesting.
But over time, he learned to handle criticism more effectively.
Like with General Meade?
Yes.
After the Battle of Gettysburg?
He was really frustrated that Meade hadn't pursued the enemy.
And maybe ended the war sooner.
Right, and Lincoln even drafted this really scathing letter. Wow.
To Meade, just ripping him apart.
But he didn't send it.
He didn't send it.
Oh.
Because he realized that, sending it would only cause more harm than good.
Right.
Like tearing Meade down wasn't going to get him the results he wanted.
And what he wanted was a unified army.
Right. A unified army ready to keep fighting.
That makes sense.
And I think this leads into another point that Carnegie makes.
Okay.
Criticism rarely accomplishes what we intended to do.
Okay.
Think about the story Father Forgets.
Oh, yeah.
This dad, who's always criticizing his son.
It's so sad.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And he doesn't realize how much he's hurting his son until it's almost too late.
So, if criticizing and condemning isn't the answer, what is?
Well, that leads to Carnegie's second principle.
Okay.
And this is the key to influencing others.
Mm-hmm.
You have to arouse in the other person an eager want.
Okay, so instead of trying to force our ideas on people, we need to figure out what they want.
Exactly.
And connect our ideas to those desires.
And so Carnegie goes back to Freud.
And John Dewey. Freud talked about our desire to be great, this deep-seated desire, and Dewey called it the desire to be important.
So it's not just about food and shelter.
Yeah.
It's about feeling valued.
Exactly.
Like we matter.
That need drives so much of our behavior.
So how does this play out in everyday life?
So Carnegie gives some great examples.
Okay.
Remember the story about Uncle Andrew and the stamp collection?
Oh, yeah.
Instead of just asking for stamps, he would write these letters to all his relatives and say, send me moneyless letters.
He knew they'd come with stamps.
He knew they would come with stamps.
That's so clever.
And so he was playing on their desire to be helpful.
And to feel important?
Yes.
That's pretty brilliant.
And then there's the story of Stan Novak and his son.
Yeah.
His son, Tim, was terrified of kindergarten.
Oh.
And so instead of forcing him to go, Stan and his wife, they made kindergarten seem exciting.
That's a good idea.
Like they focused on the finger painting and the singing songs. Or
I love it.
they even started finger painting themselves.
Oh, that's great.
So Tim went from being totally terrified to being like super excited about school.
That's so cool.
They tap into his desire for fun and play.
I mean, who doesn't like finger painting?
It's true.
So it's not about manipulating people.
No.
It's about understanding their motivation.
Exactly.
And finding a way to align our goals with theirs.
You got it.
That's good stuff.
And Henry Ford, he put it this way.
Okay.
If there's any one secret of success, it lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as from your own.
That's basically empathy.
It is empathy.
It's putting yourself in the other person's shoes.
Right.
Okay, I like that.
And that's not just like some feel-good advice.
Yeah.
This is a practical skill.
Give me an example.
Think about the difference between a poorly written business letter
Okay.
and a well-written business letter.
Okay.
The bad one just talks about what the company wants. The good one focuses on how the company can help the reader.
So solve their problem.
It's like, oh.
So it's like, instead of talking at someone,
Yeah,
you're talking with them.
you're having a conversation.
Yeah.
And Barbara Anderson, when she was applying for banking jobs,
Okay.
she did this really well.
What did she do?
Instead of listing her qualifications, she focused on how her skills could help those banks reach their goals.
And she got interviews from like every bank.
Almost every bank she applied to. So
Right.
focusing on the other person's wants
Mm-hmm.
really does work.
Okay.
But Carnegie doesn't stop there.
Okay.
He goes even deeper.
Tell me more.
He gives 6 specific ways to make people like you.
Okay.
And these aren't about tricks or manipulation. These are about building genuine, positive relationships.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What's the first one?
The first one is become genuinely interested in other people.
Okay. I'll admit, this is something I struggle with sometimes.
It's so easy to get caught up in our own world
Yeah.
and forget to really listen.
And you know what else is hard? Is like when you're thinking about what you're going to say next,
Oh, yeah.
and you're not even really listening to what the other person is saying.
Right.
But Carnegie tells the story about this fuel salesman
Okay.
who had been trying to land this big client
A chain store executive.
for years.
Years.
He'd been trying, and he'd even given a speech ranting about chain stores.
Oh, no.
But then he remembered Carnegie's advice,
Okay.
and he was like, you know what? This guy's a big deal in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go to him for advice.
Uh-huh.
So he went to the executive, and he was like,
Oh.
I'm in a debate
Mm-hmm.
about chain stores.
Uh-huh.
Can you help me understand your side?
Wow.
And the executive was so impressed
Yeah.
that he was like, you know what? I'm going to buy fuel from you.
Wow.
And he didn't even ask.
What a turnaround.
Yeah.
Just by showing a genuine interest.
I love it.
And remember that story about the young woman who was stuck in the hospital over Thanksgiving,
Oh, yeah.
feeling really lonely, and this student nurse noticed her crying?
And instead of just saying like, oh, I'm so sorry, the nurse actually shared her own feelings
That's great.
of loneliness.
She connected with her on a human level.
Yeah.
She brought her Thanksgiving dinner. She spent hours talking with her,
No.
staying way past her shift was over,
That's so nice.
and turned what could have been a miserable experience into this positive memory.
That's awesome.
It just goes to show that becoming genuinely interested in other people can make a world of difference.
Yeah.
Not just in our personal lives, but in our professional lives, too.
Okay. That's a great start. What's the next principle?
It's one we often hear, but it's worth repeating.
What is it?
Smile.
Oh, come on.
I know it sounds cheesy.
I can already hear people rolling their eyes.
But it's not about plastering on a fake grin. It's about the genuine warmth and friendliness
Okay.
that a smile conveys.
It's like nonverbal communication.
Yeah,
Makes
makes
people
you-
feel comfortable.
Makes you more approachable, more likable,
I
more trustworthy.
love it.
You know, he even talks about how you can smile over the phone.
Oh, really?
Yeah, phone companies used to train their employees to smile
Wow.
while talking on the phone
Because it changes your tone?
because it affects your tone of voice.
That's so wild.
And there's this story about a stockbroker who was known for being a real grump.
Oh, no.
And he decided to try smiling more, both at home and at work, and it changed everything.
Really?
His relationships with his family got better. His clients loved him.
Wow.
It's like this one small change had this ripple effect on his whole life.
I like that.
And there's this great Chinese proverb, that Carnegie quotes.
Okay.
A man without a smiling face must not open a shop.
I like that one.
It really highlights how important a smile is.
Okay, I'm sold on the power of a smile. What's next?
Okay, this one is simple, but so often overlooked.
Tell me.
Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language.
Ugh, I'm so bad at this.
Yeah.
I meet someone new,
Yeah.
and their name just vanishes from my brain. 2 seconds later, it's gone.
But I think the point is, we can all make more of an effort.
No?
We can repeat the person's name. When we first meet them, try to associate it with something memorable about them, just anything to help it stick.
Yeah.
Carnegie even talks about this politician, Jim Farley,
Okay.
who was famous for his ability to remember names.
How many names could he remember?
He claimed that he could call 50,000 people by their first names.
That's incredible.
I know. I can barely remember what I had for breakfast this morning.
I know, me too.
But even a small effort can make a big impact.
Okay.
Carnegie talks about this guy, Ken Nottingham, who worked at General Motors.
Okay.
And he noticed that the cafeteria lady was always scowling.
Oh, no?
And one day, he decided to greet her by name.
So he was like, hi, Eunice.
Yes, and suddenly her whole demeanor changed.
Really?
She smiled, she piled his plate high with food.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Like this tiny gesture made her whole day.
It just shows you how much those little things matter.
They really do.
Okay, so we've got genuine interest,
Yes.
smiling, remembering names.
Yeah.
What's the fourth principle?
This one's crucial. Be a good listener. Encourage others to talk about themselves.
This is another one I struggle with. It's so easy to get distracted.
We've all been there. But Carnegie reminds us that people are far more interested in themselves and their own lives than they are in us.
Yeah, that's probably true.
And Carnegie tells this great story about how he became a good conversationalist.
How did he do that?
He was at this dinner party with this botanist.
Okay.
And he basically spent the whole evening listening to this guy talk about his work.
Wow.
He didn't say much himself, but afterwards the botanist praised him as a most interesting conversationalist.
That's amazing.
Even though he'd barely spoken a word.
That is so funny.
So sometimes the best way to make a good impression is to just shut up and listen.
And Carnegie also talks about Edward E. Harriman, who got this job. By focusing on the company owner's passion for his business.
That's smart.
Instead of like bragging about his own qualifications.
Right.
He just let the owner talk
Yes.
about his work.
Yes.
And that's how he got the job.
And think about Sigmund Freud. He was known for his incredible ability to listen.
Yeah, he was like
Yeah.
a master listener.
Yes.
He could see right through people.
Making people feel truly heard and understood.
So Carnegie's telling us
Yeah.
to just be quiet and listen.
Yeah. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just listen.
Okay, I can try that.
Now, ready for the last two principles for making people like you.
Lay it on me.
Number 5 is talk in terms of the other person's interests.
Okay.
And number 6 is make the other person feel important and do it sincerely.
Those seem connected.
They are connected when you're talking about what interests someone.
Mm-hmm.
You're showing them that you care about what matters to them.
Yeah.
And that makes them feel important.
So it's about finding common ground.
It's
Like interest.
Yes.
Carnegie tells a story about a salesman
All right.
who had been trying to sell bread to this hotel for 4 years.
Oh, wow.
With no luck. And then he found out that the hotel steward was a huge checker player.
Okay.
So instead of pitching bread, they ended up talking about checkers.
For hours.
And then a few days later, the steward called him up and placed a massive order for bread.
That's amazing.
I love that.
Just by connecting on a personal level through this shared interest and making them feel important is just as crucial.
So it's not about flattery.
No.
It's about sincere appreciation.
Yes, I can do that. Carnegie shares this story about this lawyer
Okay.
who was visiting relatives in Ishik. He found himself talking to this elderly aunt.
Okay.
And instead of brushing her off, he looked for something that he could genuinely admire about her.
Oh,
And he noticed that she had this beautiful Packard car.
okay.
So he complimented her on her car.
And what happened?
And she was so touched by his genuine appreciation that she offered to give him the car.
What?
It turned out she was feeling lonely and forgotten, and his compliment made her feel seen.
Wow.
And this ties into another story about this guy, James Adamson, who was trying to get a big order for theater seats from George Eastman, the founder of Kodak.
Wow.
And instead of launching into a sales pitch,
Right?
he started by complimenting Eastman on his beautifully designed office.
Okay.
And Eastman was so flattered that he spent the rest of the meeting showing Adamson around his office,
Oh, that's cool.
proudly pointing out all the details he had personally overseen.
And by the end,
Of the meeting,
Adamson had secured a huge order for theater seats.
that's awesome.
So making people feel important can open doors you never thought possible.
These 6 principles are all about building genuine connections
Yes.
and creating a positive atmosphere. But how do we take it a step further and actually win people over to our way of thinking?
That's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Can't wait. We're going to delve into Carnegie's principles for persuasion.
Okay.
And you might be surprised at how much it ties back to what we've already discussed.
Awesome. I'm ready. So we talked about like the building blocks of
Mhm.
relationships and making people like you.
Yes.
But now, how do we actually like win people over to our way of thinking?
Right.
Because, we've all been in those conversations that devolve into arguments.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
And no one really wins in an argument.
No one wins an argument.
Even if you think you won, you probably didn't.
It probably just made the other person mad.
Yeah, and less likely to listen to you
Exactly.
in the future.
Carnegie actually says that arguing is almost always
Yeah.
a losing game.
So what do we do instead? How do we persuade people without those battles?
Well, his first principle for winning people to your way of thinking
Okay,
is pretty straightforward.
tell me.
The only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it.
But like, what if you're right? Like, shouldn't you stand up for what you believe in?
Of course you should. Stand up for your beliefs.
Yeah.
But arguing is rarely the way to do that.
So it's more about persuading them without like
Yeah.
triggering that defensive reaction.
Exactly.
And how do we do that?
Well, one way is to show respect for the other person's opinion.
Okay.
Never say you're wrong.
I mean, that's hard.
I know it's hard, especially when you hear something that you totally disagree with.
Yeah.
But telling someone they're wrong just puts them on the defensive. It
Right.
makes them less open to hearing your perspective.
He tells this story
Mm.
about this homeowner
Okay.
who was arguing with the tax inspector
Oh, boy.
about his property assessment. And the tax inspector was being totally stubborn.
And unreasonable.
And the more they argued, the worse it got.
Of course.
But then also,
Mhm.
the homeowner tried something different.
What did he do?
He shifted the focus away from the argument. And he started talking about how difficult the tax inspector's job must be.
So he showed him some respect.
Yeah, he was like, this is probably really hard, what you do.
He acknowledged his expertise.
It worked.
What happened?
The inspector softened his stance. And they actually work out a compromise.
It's amazing how a little validation can go a long way.
It really is.
And speaking of respect, his third principle is if you're wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically.
That's so hard.
I know, we're always taught
To defend ourselves.
to never admit weakness.
Yeah.
But Carnegie says admitting our mistakes actually strengthens our credibility.
Because it makes you look more trustworthy.
More trustworthy.
Yeah.
Mhm.
He shares this story
Mm-hmm.
about this father who had a huge falling out with his son.
Okay.
And it was so bad
Yeah.
that the son cut off
Yeah.
all contact with him.
Oh, wow.
But then years later, the father went to his son and said, I was wrong.
He apologized.
Yeah. And the son forgave him.
It's a powerful example
Yeah.
of how admitting our wrongs can lead to healing.
I love that.
And this leads to Carnegie's fourth principle.
Okay.
Begin in a friendly way.
Okay.
It sounds obvious, but it's easy to jump into argument mode,
Oh, yeah.
especially when you're passionate.
I know. Like, you just want to prove your point.
Yes.
But Carnegie says, well, that's not the best way to go about it.
It creates this adversarial dynamic. Like
Yeah.
you're coming at them, like you're trying to defeat them.
Makes me think of John D. Rockefeller Jr.
Okay.
and how he handled this labor strike.
He was known for his kind of gentle approach.
Yeah, he didn't go in with guns blazing.
No, he started by expressing sympathy
Yeah.
and understanding for the workers.
And that created this sense of trust
yes.
and openness.
It's like you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar.
Okay, I like that.
And Carnegie tells another story about an engineer
Okay.
who wanted to get his rent reduced,
I've been there.
but his landlord was known for being really tough.
Oh, no.
So instead of going in with demands
Yeah.
and complaints,
What did he do?
he wrote him a friendly letter.
Okay.
He started by thanking him for being a good landlord over the years, and then he explained his situation and asked for a compromise.
So nice.
And the landlord agreed.
He reduced the rent. That's awesome.
Just by being friendly.
It really shows that, like,
Yeah.
you can get more with kindness
Yes.
than you can with, like, anger.
Absolutely.
Okay, like that.
So that brings us to Carnegie's fifth principle.
Okay.
This one is about building collaboration.
Oh.
Get the other person saying yes, yes immediately.
So, like, find things you can agree on.
Exactly.
Even if they're small.
Yes.
Okay.
By getting those initial yeses, you're building momentum.
Towards a shared understanding.
Right.
Okay.
And there's a story about a fabric salesman who lost his voice
Oh, no.
right before this big meeting with a potential client.
That's terrible.
I know. But instead of canceling the meeting, he decided to go ahead with it.
Even though he couldn't talk.
Even though he couldn't talk.
So he had to communicate.
Mm.
Through writing.
Yes.
Which meant that the client had to describe the fabrics for himself.
The client was basically doing the selling for him.
Yeah.
And by the end of the meeting, the client was so convinced he placed a huge order.
Wow.
Just by saying yes, yes, yes.
That's amazing.
And this ties into Carnegie's sixth principle.
Okay.
Let the other person do a great deal of the talking.
This goes back to listening, right?
It does. It goes back to listening.
Okay.
By letting the other person talk. You're showing them respect.
Mm-hmm.
You're demonstrating that you're genuinely interested in their perspective.
Yeah.
And you never know, you might even learn something.
That's true.
Carnegie tells a story about this placement counselor
Okay.
who was initially really disliked by her colleagues
Oh, no.
because she was always bragging about her accomplishments.
Okay.
But then she realized she needed to make a change.
And what did she do?
She started letting her colleagues talk about their successes.
So she was quiet. And she listened.
And she became the most liked counselor in the agency.
Wow.
It's funny how that works. We're so focused on impressing others with our own stories.
That we forget to just listen.
Exactly.
Okay, so these principles are really making me rethink how I approach conversations. It's not about dominating or proving how smart I am.
It's about understanding the other person.
Yeah.
And finding that common ground.
I love it.
And we're only halfway through Carnegie's principles.
There's still more to uncover.
Stay tuned.
All right, so we've talked about building relationships, avoiding arguments,
Right.
persuading people.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's talk about leadership.
Okay.
Because influencing people is one thing, but leading them, that's a whole other level.
Yeah, leadership can seem like this big, intimidating concept,
Yeah.
but Carnegie breaks it down in a way that's really accessible.
Okay, good.
He says that true leadership isn't about wielding power or
Yeah.
barking orders.
So it's not about being in charge.
Mhm.
So what is it about?
It's about inspiring people to reach their full potential.
So it's more about empowering them.
Yes.
Okay.
And a lot of it comes back to those core principles we've been talking about.
Right, like understanding people, respecting their opinion.
Exactly. And
Okay.
Carnegie emphasizes that point
Yeah.
right away.
Okay.
His first principle for effective leadership is the same as his second principle for influencing people, which is arouse in the other person an eager want.
Okay, so instead of telling people what to do,
Right.
it's more about inspiring them
Yes.
to want to do it.
To want to do it.
I like that.
It's about creating that shared vision, making sure everyone's goals are aligned,
Mm-hmm.
and tapping into what truly motivates them.
It makes sense.
Effective leaders don't just give orders. They inspire people
Yeah.
to take ownership
Okay.
and work towards a common purpose.
That's good.
And that ties into his next principle.
Okay.
Talk about your own mistakes before criticizing the other person.
Oh, this is a good one. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones.
Yeah,
It's like own up. Do your own flaws.
yes.
Before you start pointing out someone else's.
It shows humility,
Yeah.
vulnerability, a willingness to take responsibility.
And Carnegie tells this story about learning to be more patient with his secretary.
Okay.
And he was realizing
Hmm.
that he was expecting too much of her,
Right.
given her lack of experience.
And instead of criticizing her, he started sharing stories about his own mistakes.
So he's basically like, hey, I've been there. We all make mistakes.
Exactly.
And it created
Yeah.
this more supportive
Well, understanding.
environment.
And she was more receptive to his feedback.
Exactly.
I like it.
And Carnegie tells this other story about this German diplomat
Okay.
who saved himself from the Kaiser's wrath.
The Kaiser.
The Kaiser.
Oh, wow.
He had made a pretty big mistake, and the Kaiser was furious.
Oh, that sounds bad.
It was a dangerous situation. But instead of making excuses,
what did he do?
He started by praising the Kaiser's leadership.
So he flattered him.
Yes. And then he admitted his own mistake.
Ah.
And expressed regret.
So smart.
And it works.
Okay.
The Kaiser forgave him.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Just goes to show that owning up to your mistakes can be incredibly powerful.
I love that.
And that ties into Carnegie's third principle for leadership.
Oh,
This one's so simple, but so profound.
okay.
No one likes to take orders.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
We all want to feel in control of our lives.
Exactly.
But how often do we actually do that?
Right.
Especially in leadership roles.
It's easy to fall into that command and control mode,
Yeah.
thinking we know best.
So what's the alternative? How do we lead without giving orders?
Carnegie highlights the leadership style of Owen D. Young,
Okay.
this really successful businessman. And Young rarely gave direct orders. Instead, he offered suggestions, he asked questions, and encouraged his team to come up with their own solutions.
So he was basically like, I trust you to figure this out.
Exactly.
I like that.
He created a culture of empowerment.
And so his team was more motivated.
More motivated.
And more productive.
And more loyal.
That's awesome.
Think about all those times when you felt micromanaged.
Oh, yeah.
Or stifled.
You don't feel very good about that.
It's demotivating.
It's the opposite of what we want to do as leaders.
Absolutely.
And this principle reminds me of that story about the executive who turned his team around. By involving them in the problem-solving process.
Yes.
He went from making all the decisions himself to empowering his team.
Right.
And that simple shift led to incredible results.
It's proof that giving people autonomy and trusting them to do their jobs
is more effective than trying to control every little detail.
Yes.
Okay.
And that leads to Carnegie's fourth principle for effective leadership.
Okay.
Let the other person save face.
This is a good one, especially in today's world, where everyone's so quick to judge.
So quick to criticize.
Yeah, it's like everyone has an ego.
Everyone has an ego.
And even when someone messes up, it's important to handle that with grace and sensitivity.
It's about preserving their dignity.
Right.
Helping them maintain a sense of self-worth.
And Carnegie tells this story about Charles Steinmetz.
Okay.
This brilliant electrical engineer who was a terrible manager.
Oh, General Electric needed to remove him
from his leadership position.
Yes, but they didn't want to hurt his feelings.
Oh.
So what they did was they created a new position for him, consulting engineer, which allowed him to focus on his strengths without having to manage people.
That's a great solution.
It's a great example of how to address a problem without making someone feel like a failure.
And it makes me think of that other story about the supervisor who made this mistake. And his boss publicly humiliated him.
Oh, no.
And he quit and went to work for a competitor.
What a loss.
Yeah.
For the company.
Yeah, and for him. Like, his confidence was shattered.
It just shows that even when someone messes up, it's important to handle it in a way that allows them to learn and grow without feeling totally demoralized.
And that leads to Carnegie's fifth principle for leadership. Praise the slightest improvement and praise every improvement. Be hearty in your approbation and lavish in your praise.
I love that.
So it's like, instead of focusing on what people are doing wrong, we should focus on what they're doing right.
Yes.
I like that.
Carnegie argues that praise is a far more powerful motivator than criticism.
Yeah.
It reinforces positive behavior, it builds confidence, and inspires people to strive for excellence. He tells the story about this piano teacher who was trying to get her student to trim her nails. Her long fingernails were making it hard for her to play. So instead of criticizing her, she said, you have such beautiful hands.
I like that.
Maybe trimming your nails would help you play better.
And it worked.
And it worked.
The student trimmed her nails.
Wow. A little bit of praise goes a long way.
It really does.
And there's another story about this impresario who was trying to get Chelyapin, this famous opera singer, to perform. But the singer was claiming to have a cold. So instead of arguing with him, the impresario expressed sympathy and even offered to cancel the performance.
Wow.
Even though it would cost him a lot of money.
So he made him feel like he had the upper hand.
Yes.
Okay.
And then he subtly appealed to the singer's ego, saying, your reputation is too important to risk a subpar performance.
So smart.
And the singer agreed to perform.
You did.
Motivated by the praise and his own desire to maintain his reputation.
It's like reverse psychology.
It is a bit of reverse psychology.
That's a good one.
And that leads to Carnegie's 6th principle for leadership.
Okay.
Give the other person a fine reputation to live up to.
I like this one.
This is about believing in people, setting high expectations, giving them the opportunity to prove themselves.
And Carnegie tells this story about this woman who was having trouble with neighborhood kids trespassing on her lawn. And she tried everything. She tried scolding them. She tried reasoning with them.
Nothing worked.
Nothing worked. So she appointed the worst offender.
The worst offender. As her detective, I know.
She put the troublemaker in charge.
She put him in charge of keeping the other kids off her lawn.
That's amazing.
And it worked.
It did?
He took his new role very seriously.
Wow.
Even threatened to brand any trespassers with a red-hot iron.
Why?
I know.
That's hilarious.
He really turned the tables on him.
It shows that, like, a little bit of trust.
A little bit of responsibility can go a long way.
And Carnegie tells another story about a landlord who was having trouble with a tenant who was behind on rent and threatening to move out. And instead of getting angry, the landlord said, I believe in you.
Wow.
I know you're a good person. I'm willing to give you some time to catch up.
And what happened?
The tenant paid his back rent and became a model tenant.
Just because the landlord believed in him?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It is pretty amazing.
And that brings us to Carnegie's final principle for effective leadership.
Okay.
Use encouragement. Make the fault seem easy to correct.
So instead of focusing on, like, blame and punishment, it's more about, like,
encouragement
and support.
And Carnegie says that's way more effective.
Yes.
Okay.
He tells the story of a father who was trying to help his son improve his math grades. Instead of focusing on his failures, he focused on his successes, celebrated every small improvement, and just kept expressing confidence in him.
That's awesome.
And the son started to excel in math.
That's a great story.
It just shows that focusing on the positive and offering support can make a huge difference.
So Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People is truly a timeless classic.
It is.
Packed with wisdom. That is just as relevant today as it was back then.
And it's not just for leaders. It's for everyone.
Yeah.
In all areas of our lives. Our relationships, our work, our personal growth.
It's about connecting with people on a deeper level.
Understanding their motivations. Inspiring them to achieve their best. If you're looking for a way to improve your relationships, your communication skills, I highly recommend this book.
It might just change your life.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep connecting.